All right, welcome to the Solutions for Networks Technology Roundtable for August 2020. Our talk, just a little introduction of who Solutions for Networks are. We're a regional Pittsburgh solution provider, really focused on networking security, UC, data center solutions. Really, with 20 years of client service and success, and we've brought together a number of our folks here today to talk about wireless networking in general. I'd like to do a couple introductions. I'm Jeff Dittmore, Vice President of Advisory Services and Infrastructure Strategy. We have Joe Ivers, our wireless practice lead, one of our lead engineers and architects. We also have Nate Saleska, who's our enterprise practice lead. He's also one of our lead engineers and architects. We have Jacob Winkle, a senior consulting engineer with a pretty broad background in both security and enterprise networking. And our newest addition to the team, Edmund Dillon, who's another one of our senior consulting engineers. This is a big portion of our wireless practice, but we certainly have a couple other folks. But today we're really going to be talking about Wi-Fi 6 and what really that new standard is going to be able to deliver for technology solutions in our client environments. Really, some of the interesting things that you come up with right from the start is that Wi-Fi 6 really has two different names, right? So the IEEE published a bunch of these, publishes the actual standards themselves and all the technical components that go into the solution. That is actually called 802.11ax, and I think up to some point last year, everybody was talking about the next generation of Wi-Fi really being 11ax Wi-Fi. But the Wi-Fi Alliance really is a group of organizations that all participate in Wi-Fi solutions, and they deal with the actual market and validate compliance of the products. What they've rebranded the 802.11ax solution as is Wi-Fi 6. What's the difference between these two things? Absolutely nothing. It's the exact same solution. It's really just two different organizations that are talking about the same thing. So I wanted to start off with a brief introduction, or just an overview of the history of Wi-Fi and how we got here. The very earliest portions of this, even before we get into the Wi-Fi Alliance being formed in 2000, the earliest versions of wireless communication, computer networking actually came out of University of Hawaii in 1971. So Aloha Net was the first wireless network in place, and it was actually 9600 bits per second, and it connected three of their universities together. The standards that they put together for Aloha Net were worked on collaboratively between the University of Hawaii and Stanford, and have become carrier sense multi-access collision detection, carrier sense multi-access with collision avoidance. All these standards that are built into the core of Ethernet actually evolved out of the Aloha Net standards from initial Wi-Fi. So all of the work that we're doing in networking all comes back to this initially. Some of what they actually have in place with Aloha Net is still being used in satellite communication today. But just to recognize the fact that we're standing on the shoulders of giants and that we didn't develop any of this stuff, even we've been doing this for a long time. This is where a lot of this computer networking started with our current standards today. So getting back to Wi-Fi, really starting, we started off with Aloha Net started this all off in 1985. The U.S. actually allocated frequencies for what would become Wi-Fi, so that's the 2.4 gig and the 5 gigahertz ranges. And in the 90s, you ended up with some frequency hopping solutions that were using those, some point-to-point solutions. Some of us probably have even touched some of that equipment, whether we installed it or had to, eventually take it out. But in the 90s, or so those were around. In 2000, the Wi-Fi Alliance was actually formed, and what they did was actually standardize or put together these standards from the IEEE and actually start validating equipment so that there would be more interoperability and you had fewer point solutions. So that first batch of standards was really 802.11b and 802.11a. followed by 11G 3 years later. Those initial solutions that were there, um, they those first three, those lasted us quite some time. Those There were certainly some security hops that we needed to get through there. In 2004 we had WPA2 to get rid of vulnerabilities with WEP, if anybody remembers that, or TKIP. Um, in 2005, it actually got Wi-Fi actually was added as a word to the dictionary. So, I guess it finally arrived. 2007, we see N. We see some developments with peer-to-peer networking. We keep developing into AC solutions. In 2018, there's a new version of security, WPA3, that was released, and that may be a topic that we get into on a future discussion. That's still actually in the process of being deployed, and it's something that's going to be included in Wi-Fi 6. And then most recently in 2019, Wi-Fi 6 was actually branded as actually in 2018 they started the Wi-Fi Alliance branded all these things with numbers. So Wi-Fi 5 was 11AC, Wi-Fi 4 was N, Wi-Fi 3 was G. They 3, 2, and 1 are implied. They didn't actually officially brand those that way, but they're implied that those are the numbers that go along with those. And the reason they did this is really just to take a step away from the IEEE standards and just use something that's more customer friendly for branding purposes. So we finally see, in last year, that Wi-Fi 6 actually gets delivered. The 11AX APs started getting deployed, and clients started showing up with that equipment. Now, when you start looking at the standards and how long these standards have been around, those first two, it was about 3 years. And if some of us were around in that period of time, my first deployment was actually in 2000. I did a deployment in an ER here in the Pittsburgh area. Um, I had touched some point-to-point bridges that, were using some of these old bridges, the old bridges that had PCMCIA cards that put into them. The clients in these areas were also PCMCIA cards that were sitting in the side of PCs and things like that. Um, and at the time, the 2.4 gig solution with B was definitely what we deployed because, the 5 GHz, you needed twice as many APs. Those are expensive. Those cards, those were expensive too. You can see that we had 3 years of those standards before G came along. G really delivered similar performance to A, but in the 2.4 gig solution. So people started replacing things in the same areas that you did those initial deployments. And then we see 4 years, we get N. We see another 6 before we get AC, and then 6 with AC before we get AX. And I was kind of curious with the folks on the call, like, where did you get your start? Like, what standards? What were your first deployments like? What Nate? Where did you start?
Yeah, I did similar stuff to you, Jeff, where it was kind of a novelty whenever I had first started. Around the same time, late '90s. I had started to see it come up. It was more of a luxury. There wasn't a bunch of folks. It was highly. There wasn't any dependability from a business side of things, but folks liked the convenience of it. So you would see, expensive PCM CIA cards or dongles. You'd have these weird dongle contraptions. You know what I mean? So you'd see a lot of that stuff out there, but you saw the writing on the wall. I mean, the technology was gonna progress. You saw it gonna kind of unfold from there. The question had always been, especially at that point, and we still kind of deal with the situation today to a lesser extent, was when can I depend on this technology to do something important, right?
Hmm.
It's always been somewhat of a convenience. So my start was kind of a similar type setup where at first it was kind of okay, sales folks with laptops or executives, who felt like they needed laptops at all times. Usually, they'd have a card that looked like some sort of weird old school Cisco GBIC or something that hung out the side, and then
Oh, those are expensive. Those are the nice ones.
yeah, man, yeah. So Expensive. I mean, I can't even. It's so strange. I mean, if you look at this timeline, what's really interesting is that a lot of this in the year 2000. We were talking to 802.11b at 11 meg, right? And we're here at coming up on 21, and this whole AX, specification and whatnot is so light years ahead of that, and it's only been 20 years. It's kind of mind-boggling in that respect. It's going to be very, very weird how things progress over the next 20 years. That's what kind of jumps out at me at this stuff. But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, it was a novelty back in the day. It was kind of a cool tech toy that folks used whenever I first started out.
How about you, Joe? Where'd you get your start?
Thinking it was around 2003, 2004. And I remember being in one hospital client, and they had some wireless out there, and they had a couple of repeaters. And so I wonder why it's so slow in these areas as well, because with the repeaters, they didn't want to run a wire, so they're cutting their whatever throughput they had, they're cutting that in half at least. I said, well, if you stretch a cable out here, you'll get a lot better signal performance. So,
Yeah, now we're doing the exact opposite. Start talking about mesh networks and things like that.
right.
Let's get rid of the cables entirely. How do we get power out there?
Right.
How about you, Ed? Where'd you get your start?
This was around 2013, and running WAPs, and this is before there was controller-based environments, or that wasn't available to the organization I was working with at the time. But so there was a lot of hand jamming to get each one of the WAPs configured and working properly. I know that Nate earlier, when you were talking about DTWRT, that was something that was put on a lot of the WAPs at the time, just to try and get more performance out of them because of the size of the business.
Yeah, without a doubt.
No, we didn't even really talk about the controller versus autonomous AP differences, but thank God that we can configure these things in a few simple places now.
That was huge. The advent of controllers in the mix, I think, it was subtly huge to the whole thing. I think.
Yeah, I didn't even include any of that discussion in this. This is really more about the standards, but
sure.
Just architecturally, some of those changes were amazing for us.
Yep.
How about you, Jake?
Autonomous deployment. Wireless was already integrated in laptops at this time, so those cards were ancient history. So I didn't have to deal with any peripherals like that. N was widely deployed, so I didn't have to deal with B, A, or G. That all kind of was going away.